Welcome, traveler of time. You've entered a realm where kings rise, empires fall, and every crown carries a curse. Today, we journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating monarchs, where love, power, and destiny intertwine. Snow drifts quietly over the spires of Moscow. The winter air bites like iron, and somewhere in the heart of the Kremlin, a child listens to the echo of footsteps in a corridor far too vast for a boy so small. He is Ivan, son of Vasily III, heir to the Russian throne. And though his name will one day shake the earth, tonight he is only a shadow in a palace of ghosts. His father is dead. His mother, the powerful Elena Glinskaya, rules as regent, but the court is a nest of serpents. Boyar nobles whisper, plot, and strike from behind veiled smiles. By the time Ivan turns 8, his mother is dead too, poisoned, many believe by the very hand sworn to protect him. And so begins the story of a child abandoned in luxury, surrounded by betrayal, who would grow to become Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of all Russia. The legend of his reign begins not in glory, but in fear. In the silent corridors of the Kremlin, the young Ivan watches the boyars fight over his inheritance. He sees them drag nobles through the halls, their boots echoing against marble floors. He hears laughter, cruel, careless, and sometimes cries muffled behind closed doors. He learns early that power is not given, is taken, and mercy, in this world, is only a story told to the weak. When night falls, the boy retreats to his chambers and reads from holy scriptures by candlelight. He stares at the flickering flame and dreams not of peace, but of vengeance. He imagines himself grown, holding the scepter, commanding those who once mocked him to kneel. In his dreams, the halls are silent again, not because the chaos is gone, but because he has silenced it. The churchmen who serve him whisper that he has a fire in his soul. They say the boy prays longer than most priests, that he weeps at icons and rages at injustice. Yet even they can see it. The same intensity that makes him brilliant could one day make him monstrous. He studies the saints, but remembers the sinners. He listens to sermons of forgiveness, but his heart keeps the score of every insult. When he turns 13, the balance shifts. The boyars still think him a puppet, a pale reflection of his father. But Ivan has learned their game. He calls for a feast, a grand banquet in the Kremlin's Great Hall. Wine flows, music plays, laughter fills the air. Then, with a calmness that chills every heart, Ivan orders one of the most powerful boyars, Prince Shuaysky, seized and torn apart by Ivan's own hunting dogs. The message is clear. The boy is gone. The Tsar has been born. Outside the palace walls, the people whisper. Some call him chosen by God, a ruler destined to cleanse Russia of corruption. Others fear him already, for there is something in his eyes that sees too much. The priests bless him, the nobles bow, but behind their reverence lies dread. They can sense what's coming, a reign that will be unlike any other. When Ivan is crowned in 1547, he does something no ruler before him has done. He takes not the title of Grand Prince, but Tsar, Caesar, the divine ruler of all Russia. In that moment, he transforms Muscovy from a fragmented realm into an empire under God's anointed. Church bells thunder across Moscow as the golden crown of Monomach is placed upon his head. Candles flicker, incense fills the air, and the chants of priests echo through the cathedral vaults like thunder in heaven. Yet behind his solemn face, Ivan's thoughts are already turning dark. For as the crown presses down upon his brow, he feels not the weight of glory, but the curse of destiny. The same boyars who murdered his mother now kneel before him. He smiles faintly, not in forgiveness, but in quiet promise. Their day will come. For the first few years of his rule, Ivan the Terrible reigns with surprising grace. He reforms law, opens trade, builds schools, and brings order to the chaos of Russia's feudal lands. To his people, he appears wise, almost saintly. He marries Anastasia Romanovna, a gentle woman whose kindness tempers his fury. Under her love, for a time, the demons within him sleep. But peace never lasts long for kings born fire. The scars of his childhood run deep, too deep for time to heal. He cannot forget the betrayals of his youth, nor the poison that took his mother. Every banquet feels like a trap, every smile like a blade behind silk. He dreams of shadows moving in the corridors, of voices plotting in the dark. And in those dreams, the old hunger returns. The hunger for control, absolute and divine. Some nights, when the court has gone silent and Moscow lies under snow, Ivan walks the corridors alone. He touches the walls as if to remind himself they are real, that the crown he wears is not an illusion. But even in solitude, he feels watched by God, by ghosts, by his own conscience. He kneels before the icons and whispers prayers that sound more like confessions. And as candlelight trembles across his face, one can almost see the war within him, between the boy who sought justice and the czar who would rule through fear. In those moments, history holds its breath, because from this fragile balance, from a ruler torn between mercy and vengeance, will rise a storm that will drown his kingdom in blood. And though he does not yet know it, the throne he has claimed will become his own undoing. For power, once touched, demands sacrifice, and Ivan the Terrible will give it everything. The boy who is starved of love will learn to feed on fear. The king who dreamed of glory will rule through terror, and the empire that rose beneath his hand will tremble beneath his wrath. The story of Ivan the Terrible's reign has only just begun, and as the snow falls over Moscow's golden domes, a single truth glimmers beneath the frost. Even kings born in God's light can be swallowed by their own shadow. The winter of 1547 would test the new Tsar's soul. Moscow burned that year, a fire so fierce it devoured a city of stone and faith. Flames licked the cathedral domes, and the sky glowed red as if the heavens themselves had turned against him. Thousands perished, their screams echoing through streets lined with ash. And when the smoke cleared, the people whispered that it was not lightning or fate that struck them down, but the wrath of God, punishing a sinful ruler. Ivan stood among the ruins, his face carved in stone. The smoke clung to his robes, the scent of death to his memory. He saw orphans in the streets, starving families begging for help, and the weight of his crown felt heavier than ever. For the first time, the Tsar felt what every ruler dreads, the doubt of his people. They loved him once, but now, fear had found its way into their prayers. Yet from the ashes, Ivan the Terrible reign would rise in brilliance. The fire had not only burned his city, it had forged his resolve. He rebuilt Moscow with walls stronger than before, ordered cathedrals razed where ruins had stood, and swore that never again would Russia bow to chaos. He began to believe that God himself had chosen him to lead this land, not as a man, but as a divine instrument of order. In those early years, he ruled with vision. He codified laws to bring justice where corruption had ruled. He created councils to advise him, expanded trade routes through the icy rivers of the north, and invited scholars from distant lands to shape a new Russia, one that could stand beside empires. His marriage to Anastasia Romanovna seemed to bring him peace. Her calm presence softened his temper. Her faith guided his spirit. When Ivan walked among the people, they called him the good Tsar. Children ran to his carriage. Peasants kissed the hem of his robe. He was young, charismatic, and brilliant, a ruler who could have become the architect of a golden age. Under his command, the Russian armies marched eastward, capturing the Tatar strongholds of Kazan in a thunder of cannons and smoke. The victory at Kazan was not just military triumph. It was destiny fulfilled. The bells of Moscow rang for days, and the people hailed their Tsar as a new Alexander, a chosen defender of the Orthodox faith. Ivan rode into the capital beneath banners of gold, his army behind him, and the conquered banners of Kazan carried before him like trophies of divine justice. For a moment, the entire realm believed in him. The chroniclers wrote that the Tsar had brought salvation to Russia. The priests called him God's hammer upon the heathens. And in those fleeting years, Ivan himself believed it. But peace is a fragile crown. Victory breeds envy, and faith can curdle into fanaticism. As the empire grew, so too did the cracks in the Tsar's mind. His courts swelled with flatterers and spies. His advisors argued, and his nobles whispered that the Tsar's reforms had gone too far, that he was placing too much power in his own hands. Then came the wound that no sword could inflict. In 1560, His beloved Anastasia fell ill. Ivan prayed for days, fasting and pleading before the icons, his knees bleeding against the cold stone floor. But the sickness spread, and one morning she was gone. The light of his soul went with her. They said the Tsar screamed like a wounded beast, that he tore his robes and smashed icons, accusing his boyars of poisoning her, the same poison that took his mother. The grief that could have broken him instead ignited something darker. A storm began to gather, silent, unseen, but vast. Ivan withdrew from the world. He spent hours locked in his chambers, staring at nothing, muttering prayers that sounded like curses. He spoke less to his advisors and more to the saints he saw in his visions. He wrote letters filled with divine fury, speaking of a Russia corrupted by sin and betrayal. To those who approached him, his eyes seemed to burn, not with anger, but with revelation. He began to believe that the same God who crowned him had now chosen him for purification, not through mercy, but through terror. And those who had betrayed him, real or imagined, would face the wrath of a Tsar who saw himself as both ruler and judge. By 1564, the court had become a theater of suspicion. Servants whispered that spies watched every corner of the palace. Noblemen vanished overnight. Ivan's mood changed without warning. Laughter one moment, rage the next. And then, without a word, the Tsar disappeared. He rode out of Moscow under heavy snow, taking his treasure and his closest guards. For weeks, Russia was silent. The capital panicked. The boyars feared he had fled, or worse, planned revenge. Then came the letter. Ivan wrote from the fortress of Alexandrov, declaring that he would no longer rule a realm poisoned by traitors. He accused the clergy, the nobles, even his own council, of betraying his trust. He would resign the throne, he said, and leave Russia to its chaos. Panic erupted. The people begged for his return. They cried in the streets, fearing that without their Tsar, God would abandon them. The boyars, terrified of losing their power, pleaded for forgiveness. And when Ivan returned, he returned not as a man, but as something else entirely. He demanded absolute authority, divine and unchallenged. He created a new order, the Oprichnina, a kingdom within a kingdom, ruled only by him. He divided Russia in two, one for the common people and the church, and another, his, where his black-clad riders, the Oprichniki, would enforce his will with fire and blade. They dressed in black, rode horses with dog heads mounted on their saddles, and carried brooms, symbols of sniffing out and sweeping away treason. To them, Ivan was not merely Tsar. He was the voice of God's judgment on earth. The age of reform was over. The age of terror had begun. Ivan's reign, once radiant with promise, had darkened into legend. His empire would know peace no longer, only silence, fear, and the endless beating of hooves through snow. The boy who once dreamed of justice had returned to his throne, not as the savior of Russia, but as its scourge. And so, the Ivan the Terrible reign entered its most dreadful chapter, a reign that would turn prayer into screams and loyalty into ashes. The Black Riders came at dawn. They appeared through the mist like phantoms, cloaked in darkness, faces hidden beneath iron helms, dogs snarling at their stirrups. The Oprichniki, Ivan's sacred brotherhood, spread across the land like a plague of judgment. Their banners bore the image of a severed head. Their oaths were spoken not to crown or church, but to Ivan himself, God's chosen executioner. The Ivan the Terrible reign had entered its crucible. Across Russia, bells tolled not for worship, but for warning. Villages saw the dust of black horses before they heard the cries. The Oprichniki hunted traitors, heretics, and anyone whose loyalty was deemed less than absolute. Whole towns fell silent overnight. Boyars who had once feasted at Ivan's table were dragged from their estates and made to confess crimes they never committed. To Ivan, it was not cruelty. It was purification. He saw himself as the surgeon of a sick kingdom, a holy blade cutting away rot. His letters to his council were written in the language of prophecy. I am the hand of the Lord, he wrote, and through me, Russia will be cleansed of its sin. The Oprichniki obeyed without question. They rode through forests and villages, bearing torches and iron hooks. They hanged nobles from their own gates, drowned priests in frozen rivers, and burned entire estates in the name of divine order. In the capital, the air smelled of smoke and fear. In his fortress of Alexandrov, Ivan built a world apart from reality. Its walls were painted black, its chambers filled with chanting monks and musicians playing funeral hymns. The Tsar would lead mock processions dressed as an abbot, performing parodies of the Mass, and then, moments later, order executions in the courtyard outside. The line between sacred and profane vanished, replaced by the Tsar's vision of divine rule. Some nights, he gathered his Oprichnina for feasts that bordered on madness. They drank from gilded cups, laughed beneath chandeliers of bone, and toasted to the Tsar's glory. Then, as laughter died, Ivan would signal, and one of them would be dragged away, accused of treason, and executed before the rest. None dared protest. In Ivan's world, even loyalty was suspect. His paranoia deepened with every passing year. Spies whispered of plots that may never have existed. Priests prayed that God would temper his wrath. Yet the Tsar saw enemies everywhere, in foreign ambassadors, in his own generals, even among his kin. When the city of Novgorod was accused of conspiring with Lithuania, Ivan saw it as proof of divine betrayal. He marched with his Oprichnina through snow and ice, 1,000 strong, a tide of black horses and cold iron. For 5 weeks, Novgorod burned. Ivan stood in the cathedral as the bells tolled, his eyes reflecting the fire outside. The streets ran red as the Fokov River froze around bodies of the slain. Women, children, monks, none were spared. The Tsar ordered priests whipped and merchants drowned, claiming the city had turned against God. Even the icons seemed to weep soot as smoke rose to heaven. Those who survived said that Ivan walked through the carnage with calm reverence, blessing the dead as if performing a ritual. He believed he had delivered justice, divine, absolute, unquestionable. But to his people, the Tsar had become the very monster he once feared. The Ivan the Terrible reign, once a symbol of unity, now divided the realm by terror. The nobles were broken, the clergy silenced, and the peasants turned to prayer, whispering the Tsar's name as both curse and plea. Yet beyond his cruelty, Ivan's mind remained sharp, even brilliant. He restructured the army, reformed governance, and expanded Russian borders through relentless campaigns. His vision of a centralized, powerful Russia, ruled by one will, one faith, one Tsar, would shape the nation for centuries. But the cost was unbearable. As the wars dragged on, his armies met defeat in Livonia. His trusted generals fell one by one, some to enemy swords, others to the Tsar's suspicion. When Prince Kurbsky, one of Ivan's closest commanders, fled to Poland, the betrayal shattered what little trust remained. Ivan's letters to him, written in venom and scripture, spoke not as man to man, but as prophet to heretic. Each failure deepened the Tsar's conviction that he was surrounded by traitors. The Oprichnina's purges grew even bloodier. Their executions became public rituals, heads displayed on pikes, streets lined with corpses as warnings. In the Kremlin, the throne stood upon a floor darkened by the stains of its own history. But even tyrants crave the illusion of righteousness. Ivan began commissioning icons that depicted him not as ruler, but as penitent, kneeling before Christ, his hands outstretched in sorrow. He confessed his sins, only to commit them again. The contradiction was his truth. He believed that his cruelty was an instrument of God's mercy. And yet, in the quiet moments between his outbursts, the Tsar felt the weight of isolation. His court was a graveyard of silence. The laughter that once filled the Kremlin had long turned to echoes. His children grew wary of his gaze, and his advisors spoke only in whispers. He would walk alone through the palace halls, passing the portraits of his ancestors. He would stop before one, his father, Vasily III, and stare for hours as if trying to remember what it meant to rule without fear. But those memories are gone. The child who once dreamed of justice had been consumed by his own fire. When a comet blazed across the sky in 1577, the priest called it an omen. Ivan saw it as confirmation. He believed heaven itself had marked him as both savior and destroyer. "The stars bear witness," he wrote, "that I am the scourge of the wicked. The empire trembled under his reign. Cities rebuilt from ashes only to fall again. Faith turned to fanaticism, love to paranoia. And in the stillness of the Russian night, when snow blanketed the earth like a shroud, even the wind seemed to carry whispers of fear. For the Ivan the Terrible reign had become something more than history. It was legend in motion, a tragedy still unfolding. The man who had sought to purify his kingdom now stood alone upon a mountain of bones, convinced that the blood he spilled was holy. And though the fires of Novgorod faded, the flames within him burned ever brighter, too bright for any mortal crown to contain. Soon, even his own family would feel their heat. The great bell of Moscow tolled over a city suffocating in silence. Once a symbol of divine power, it now echoed like a funeral knell for an empire tearing itself apart. The streets were empty, their cobblestones still stained from the blood of those Ivan's guards had executed in his fury. The Tsar's reign, once proclaimed as ordained by God, had become a curse upon the land. This was no longer a kingdom. It was a graveyard with walls. The man once hailed as Ivan the Terrible now resembled a ghost haunting his own empire. His black robes dragged across the floors of the Kremlin's dim corridors, where the whispers of murdered advisors seemed to cling to the air. His beard had grown unkempt. His eyes burned with a feverish madness. The crown that had once gleamed on his head now felt like an iron shackle. The same hands that built Russia's might had become instruments of its torment. He had survived every betrayal, real or imagined, but victory had hollowed him. The more he killed, the smaller he became. It was as if his soul was being carved away with every execution order he signed. When he looked upon his throne, he saw not power, but accusation. One winter night, Ivan stood over a map of his empire. The parchment was torn and stained with candle wax and blood. His generals had long grown weary of war. The treasury was empty. Famine stalked the countryside. Yet he demanded another campaign, against anyone, against everyone. If the Tsar does not strike, he dies, he muttered to himself, his trembling hand gripping the hilt of his staff. Even the Oprichnina, his feared secret police, began to waver. Their loyalty, born of terror, was faltering under the weight of his madness. They whispered of the old Tsar who laughed, who dreamed of uniting the Russian lands. That man was gone, devoured by his paranoia. What remained was a monarch obsessed with shadows. Then, tragedy struck where his paranoia was weakest, within his own family. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, was everything the Tsar was not: intelligent, compassionate, and beloved by the people. He spoke of peace, of ending the purges, of restoring the faith of a nation that had forgotten mercy. To the Tsar, these were not virtues, they were threats. He saw in his son's growing influence the specter of betrayal, the same that had haunted him since childhood. One day, a quarrel erupted, small at first, about the pregnant wife of his son. Ivan accused her of dressing immodestly, unfit for a tsarevna. In blind rage, he struck her down, causing her to miscarry. His son, horrified, confronted him. The air in the chamber turned electric. Words became shouts. Shouts became fury. The Tsar's staff rose, and before reason could intervene, it fell, cracking against his son's skull. The sound of bone meeting would echoed like the breaking of destiny itself. The young man collapsed. Blood pooled beneath him. Ivan froze. His hand trembled as the staff dropped from his grasp. He knelt beside his dying son, calling his name over and over, but only silence answered. Witnesses said that moment shattered something inside him forever. The man who had once made princes kneel wept like a child, his sobs echoing through the marble halls. He pressed his hands against the wound, as if he could force life back in a body he had destroyed. "I have killed my son," he whispered over and over, a mantra of damnation. From that day, Ivan was no longer a ruler, but a penitent ghost. He dressed in rag beneath his robes, muttering prayers that even priests found unsettling. He wandered the Kremlin at night, speaking to shadows, calling out to the ghosts of his murdered kin. The throne room grew cold. Servants said they could hear weeping in the dark. His court shrank. His allies turned distant. The land he had united through blood began to crumble. Villages lay abandoned. trade dwindled, and the clergy feared his unholy wrath. Russia, vast and silent, seemed to mourn its own ruler. And yet, he could not die, not yet. It was as though fate forced him to linger, to feel every ounce of the horror he had unleashed. His health deteriorated, his body bloated and trembled with sickness, but his mind, that sharp, merciless blade, remained awake, haunted by memory. He would sit for hours staring at his son's portrait, his eyes empty. In those last years, he attempted to atone. He rebuilt churches, offered donations, even sought to abdicate the throne, only to seize it back days later, consumed by fear of betrayal. The cycle never ended. Repentance followed by paranoia, faith followed by fury. In 1584, under a sky heavy with snow, Ivan entered the Kremlin's Chamber of State. He sat before the chessboard, his only companion an old friend, Bogdan Belsky. As they played, Ivan laughed, a sound brittle as ice. "Check," he said, smiling faintly. Then his hand froze midair. His body convulsed, and his head struck the table. The chess pieces scattered, white and black, tumbling together like the souls of the damned and the saved. Ivan the Terrible, Tsar of all Russia, scourge and savior alike, was dead. They say his face, in death, bore a strange peace, as if, at last, the voices had gone quiet. Yet his empire did not rest. His death plunged Russia into chaos. The time of troubles, a storm of famine, false heirs, and foreign invasions. His throne became a curse passed from one trembling hand to another. The legend of Ivan the Terrible's reign was not just one of cruelty, but of contradiction, a man who built a nation while breaking it. His life was both prophecy and warning, a reminder that unchecked power consumes even its master. As snow covered the Kremlin walls, it was said the wind carried whispers, the voice of a czar calling out to the son he had slain, lost forever in the silence of his own making. The Kremlin bells tolled once more, not in warning this time, but in mourning. Inside the cold marble halls where Ivan the Terrible had reigned, his body lay beneath a crimson shroud. The candles around him burned low, their light flickering like the dying heartbeat of a kingdom. Monks chanted prayers for his soul, but even their voices trembled, unsure whether they were pleading for mercy or forgiveness. Outside, Moscow stood still. Snow blanketed the city, muffling every sound, as though the land itself hesitated to breathe. The peasants crossed themselves. Nobles whispered of curses. Few wept. Most simply watched, waiting for what none could say. The death of Ivan marked the end of an age, but not of his shadow. His reign, Ivan the Terrible's reign, had left wounds that would take centuries to heal. He had transformed Russia from a scattered collection of principalities into a unified state, feared across continents. Yet the price of unity was terror. His crown was won through blood, his peace secured through fear, his greatness carved from human suffering. Even now, centuries later, historians argue over his name. Was he terrible for his cruelty, or terrible in the old Russian sense? Awesome, formidable, beyond mortal measure? Perhaps he was both. For Ivan was not merely a man. He was the embodiment of the contradictions that forged empires. The people remembered the terror first. The Oprichnina had vanished, but their specter lived on in nightmares. Black-cloaked riders galloping through smoke, their dogs' heads dangling from saddles, hunting traitors who might never have existed. In villages, old women told tales of the Tsar who could see into men's hearts, who could command storms and summon death with a word. To them, Ivan was not dead. He had simply returned to the darkness from which power is born. Yet others remembered a different truth. It was Ivan who had broken the power of the boyars, the arrogant nobles who for centuries had kept Russia divided. It was Ivan who expanded the borders of Muscovy, opening the road to Siberia and beyond. It was Ivan who made the Tsar more than a title. He made it an idea, an unchallengeable force. He had carved order from chaos, but the hand that built was the same hand that destroyed. The paradox haunted those who came after him. His successors inherited both his crown and his curse. The empire he left was vast but brittle, powerful but bleeding. When famine swept through the land, the people said it was the wrath of the dead Tsar. When impostors rose, claiming his bloodline, They said it was his vengeance. Even in death, he ruled, not from a throne, but from legend. In the cathedrals he had built, his name was whispered in fear. Priests prayed for his soul, uncertain whether he had ever truly sought redemption. The image of him, wild-eyed, draped in fur, clutching a cross with one hand and a sword with the other, became both icon and warning. Artists painted him as a tyrant consumed by demons. Others painted him as a prophet guided by divine fire. Between those two visions lay the real man, lost to time. Centuries later, the question still echoes. Was Ivan the Terrible a monster or a maker of nations? The answer, perhaps, lies in the mirror he holds to the human soul. For what is power, if not a reflection of our own desire to control, to create, to destroy? In Ivan's story, one can see the eternal struggle between vision and vanity, faith and fury. He believed he was chosen by God, yet every act of violence drew him further from salvation. His love for Russia became indistinguishable from his fear of losing it. In the end, the empire and the man became one, vast, haunted, and unrelenting. As centuries passed, his legend outgrew the walls of Moscow. Writers would call him the first true czar, while others branded him the first dictator. Poets would describe his gaze as that of a man who saw too far, into the hearts of men, into the abyss of his own soul. Modern Russia still bears his shadow. The Kremlin towers he built still stand. The Orthodox churches he adorned still echo with his prayers. His cathedral, St. Basil's, crowned with colors and flame-like domes, remains the symbol of Russia itself. To tourists, it is beautiful. To history, it is a monument built on fear. And somewhere within that beauty lies the paradox of Ivan the Terrible. His reign teaches that greatness without mercy is ruin, and power without conscience is madness. He dreamed of eternal order, but left only chaos in his wake. He wanted to be remembered as the father of Russia. Instead, he became the warning of its soul. The legend says that on stormy nights, when the wind howls across the Kremlin, you can hear the clatter of hooves, the Oprichnina riding once more, and behind them, the whisper of a Tsar's voice, asking forgiveness no one can grant. His spirit, restless and eternal, roams the land he built and broke. History may have buried Ivan beneath the weight of centuries, but it cannot silence his echo. For every ruler who reaches too far, for every empire that builds on fear, the ghost of Ivan rises, a reminder that crowns are not symbols of glory, but of burden. In the end, Ivan the Terrible's greatest tragedy was not what he did to others, but what power did to him. It consumed him slowly, stripping away love, reason, and hope until only the throne remained. A throne carved of gold and soaked in blood. And as the last candle fades in the Kremlin's endless corridors, the voice of the narrator returns, calm, distant, eternal. Centuries later, the echoes of Ivan the Terrible's reign still haunt the ruins of history. If stories like this fascinate you, don't forget to like and subscribe. More untold tales of history await you.